Okay, well, I'm very happy to go first, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a long time since the invite came, and it's a shame that we're not meeting in person because I was looking forward to the field trip to Spurn Head, so maybe we can do that another time. But I'll just give you some thoughts about how I became interested in coastal settlement and how it's keyed into my research career to begin with. I started, well, I come from quite a coastal area from the Wirral and used to play in the sand dunes and heard from my history teachers at school that a lot of interesting ancient finds had been found there, but nobody really understood them or could, what we would now say, contextualize them historically. And this is something I attempted to do in part of my PhD. And as an early medieval archaeologist, I came to this through the study of the early medieval period in the west of Britain. And there are a whole series of sites producing really interesting metalwork mainly. It's mainly metalwork because of the way it was collected, but there is other stuff there as well of the 5th, 6th, 7th to 10th, 11th centuries AD that I took a look at. And some of these have been lying in obscurity for many, many decades, and others have had more recent work. And an example of how this material comes to light is through the sort of antiquarian process. And this is something I've been particularly interested in relation to one of the sites I'll talk about in a minute, Mells. But over in Ireland, there are a whole series of antiquarians who were competing with each other in the 19th century to find objects eroding from sandhill sites or sand dune sites. And this is an example of the county of Donegal, which Ryan O'Floyne has written up in a local archaeological publication. Really interesting stuff. This is a sort of stamp collecting form of archaeology. They would score points against each other for which type of pin or which type of object they'd found. But it took a long time before anyone began to understand this in a sort of settlement or environmental way. One of the first people to do so was a very interesting female scholar called Mrs. Bruna Cardy, who produced a monograph in 1914 on the sandhill sites of Ireland. It's quite a classic, actually, very hard to get hold of these days, but it was at University College Cork. And so there was this really interesting work on these sites in the far west of Ireland. And some of the objects were illustrated, not all of them survived, but those of us who know about the Viking Age can see amongst these the type of ring pins and stick pins that one would associate with the 9th to 11th centuries AD, together with some earlier stuff, penannular brooches. And really, what do these represent? One thing that's clear from this early work is that there's quite a long time period expressed here. So there are objects from the pre-Roman Iron Age, the Roman Iron Age in Ireland, or the Roman period in Britain, through to high medieval. And what does this very long time scale tell us about the use of these coastal locations over millennia, really? The site which interested me for a long time and I think needs more work is down in the southwest of Scotland at Luce Bay, where a typical sort of picture has emerged of antiquarian collecting over many decades from a huge sandy wasteland known as Torres Warren at the head of Luce Bay. And this has been to some extent contextualized by slightly more recent work. The Jopes, Martin Jope, did an excavation here in the 50s and found part of a medieval settlement which has now been covered up again by sand. And there was some environmental sampling work in the 70s on Torres Warren, which kind of showed us a bit about the Bronze Age, essentially. But trying to link these two periods together in a succession of environmental modifications and trying to chart the influence of different sand blows and erosion phases over time, that has to come later, really. This is too big an area to have been able to understand that in that kind of way all those years ago. One thing we lack in the early medieval period is really much in the way of historical sources describing what's going on here. Many of the objects would appear to indicate external trade, and it's hard to characterize that without any sort of historical references. I've suggested that several of the coastal sites were beach markets, And Ken Dark, who picked up a suggestion by Hallam Movius, the American archaeologist from the 1930s who was active in Ireland, was that these were a class of site, that the Dark Age, if you like, beach markets were a form of site comparable, if you like, to Tintagel and those other sort of more famous sites with a bit more structural expression. When we get past the Norman conquest, we get a lot more information about what's going on, and we see weather systems being expressed in various different historical sources, often not directly, but in chronicles there'll be a mention of some terrible weather event, or quite often a flood. And we can see, because floods affect not just the British Isles but neighbouring parts of Europe, in European accounts, that there were a number of extremely devastating weather events in the High Middle Ages picked up in Dutch, Belgian and Danish sources. And this is a kind of study where we can look at the kind of sites which we see around our own bit of the world, but we must see this in a regional environmental perspective. And these are some sites which I don't have time to go through in any great detail, but I have published an article in Medieval Archaeology in 2015, which you're welcome to have a look at, and this kind of essentially summarises what I'm saying today to a great extent. Earlier than that, we had a workshop back in 2004 for all of the archaeologists interested in working on sand dune landscapes in Scotland, and this was hosted by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. We had some brilliant papers from people working in the Western Isles, doing multispectral imaging of sand dune landscapes, and from major excavations such as those undertaken by Mike Parker Pearson and Neil Sharples, etc. in the Western Isles. I've undertaken quite a bit of work in Orkney, which I'll mention briefly later on. I'm not putting my own work forward as the example to look to in this case, but it's an experience that I've had of working in sand-influenced landscapes, and I think there's a set of particularly interesting archaeological challenges in characterizing and excavating remains within these mobile and very dynamic and often very heavily protected on an environmental level sand landscapes. And we see really the whole kind of business of medieval settlement. When you say to a student, let's think about medieval settlement in England, let's say, instantly the image comes to mind of green fields, perhaps a church standing on its own, surrounded by yew trees and lots of humps and bumps of earthworks around it. And that's your classic deserted medieval village, Warren Percy and all the others that we know and love. Around the coast, there's a rather different feel to the way in which settlement change occurred, and this is very heavily driven by the relationship which people had with the sea. The coast is a very advantageous place to live in many ways, because it offers a whole range of what might be described as affordances. That's a bit of a buzzword, but sort of environmental opportunities. You can exploit the sea and the intertidal zone, as well as the terrestrial landscape, for food, hunting, etc., wildfowling, fishing. But of course, living by the sea brings its own dangers as well. The coastline as we see it today is only really where the sea happens to be at this moment. And this has changed a lot over time, going right back to the Mesolithic, of course. The landscape of what is now Britain was much bigger, and the sea was much further away from today's inhabited areas. And this, in the post-glacial period, has crept up, and the changes of climate and weather over the millennia have affected the way in which the landscape has responded with erosion. And of course, the other big factor is the way that people respond to that. And people often do things trying to resist the forces of nature, which in some cases are successful, and in other cases are a disaster, because they sort of produce an enhanced or exacerbated effect. People tend to overexploit the resources they have available to them, and then there's some kind of reaction to the changes that brings about. And we can see that happening in the medieval period, which of course is a period of considerable climatic and of course allied cultural change. Some of the sites on these maps are sites which have disappeared due to erosion. Dunwich is a famous example on the coast of East Anglia, which our president has been involved in researching. Ravensrod, which is, or Ravensor, which is near Hull on the Humber estuary, a famous case of quite a big borough in the High Middle Ages, which has totally disappeared now, and I think it's a very interesting case study. Where you have erosion on the coast, usually nearby you have some form of enhanced deposition. This material has to go somewhere. And in other parts of the coastline where there's coastal retreat happening, we see accretion, and this very often takes the form of wind-blown sand or aeolian sand. One of the factors with lowering sea levels, which may be a factor here because we're talking about transition from the medieval warm period to the so-called Little Ice Age in the High Middle Ages and onwards. Let me say that these concepts are kind of a bit controversial amongst some groups of scholarship, but I think the weight of legitimate scholarship favours this whole idea that the early Middle Ages were to some extent a warmer climate, and it gets quite a bit colder by the 15th, 16th centuries. And one factor with global cooling is that sea level tends to be taken up by the polar ice caps, which grow, and therefore you have lower sea levels that exposes more of the intertidal zone at low tide. We have a very big tidal range around Britain. Similarly, in the Bay of Biscay, we have a lot of sand dune landscapes as well. And when the wind gets on the sand, it just blows it into great hummocks of dunescapes, and these are now regarded as very beautiful and environmentally precious, with lots of wildlife and plant life that you don't get elsewhere. And the Sefton coast near Liverpool being an example. However, they're also a form of devastation, because when the sand comes in, first of all, it covers up cultivated areas, and people struggle against this with all kinds of means of prolonging their kind of fertility. And eventually, at some point, there's a psychological point where they decide that they've had enough. And they need to move, and we see settlement shift away from the coastlines towards more inland areas, which had previously not been as attractive. We can certainly see that happening in the northern and western Isles of Scotland. So in many ways, sand inundation is a slowish kind of thing. People respond to it and try to control it. They build banks to try and stop it. They alter the way in which rivers flow, and this in some cases makes it worse. In other occasions, we have some more dramatic historical evidence of very sudden inundation, and the site at 4V on Aberdeenshire, the Aberdeenshire coast, which is very close to Donald Trump's golf course, if anybody knows that area. There's a church which is poking out the sand dunes here, and in one of the cartularies of Arbroath, there's a note that this happened really almost overnight. A huge creeping wave of sand came in and sort of devastated this settlement. And this is really at the more catastrophic end of sand inundation. And it took many years for the church to be re-exposed. Of course, by that time, the economic life of the settlement had completely gone. What you tend to find is that these sites have an identity in early to high medieval sources from Domesday onwards, either as a borough or a parish. And once they've been inundated, that tends to go and they become amalgamated or a part of some other entity, and they lose their kind of preeminence as part of the political geography of their areas. Kenfig on the south coast of Wales, on the Glamorgan Coast, is an amazing place to go and visit. It's a sea of now vegetation covered sand dunes. There's a castle that's really sort of poking its head out of these dunes, and there's been some quite brilliant magnetometry there by GSB Surveys, which were very kindly they allowed me to reproduce their plot in my Medarc article. There's a whole town under this sand, and this again happened pretty quickly. In it was a borough founded in 1147, and by 1185 it was a major port. There were 24 ships trading here, and First of all, with sand below, the pastures went, which reduced the viability of the sort of daily life of the settlement. And the buildings were mostly abandoned in the 1410s, 1420s, 1430s. And as far as I'm concerned, you can take your own view about this, but this curious period at the beginning of the 15th century seems to be a time when what had been relatively slow processes of coastal change and environmental sand inundation seems to speed up quite a lot. There's something a bit catastrophic happening, and there's a whole series of references in historical sources to this period being a time of major change and major desertion of sites. So this fits in really with this whole idea of settlement change and desertion in the Middle Ages. There are a whole series of interesting books about this, and Hubert Lamb's classic you can see displayed here, Climate History in the Modern World. It's almost about the way that climate psychologically influences people, how people's behavior responds to the threats and opportunities that climate change brings with it. Of course, we're now experiencing very dramatic anthropogenically driven climate change, and this is the graph at the top. The reported severe sea floods per century kicks off quite a bit after 1000, but of course there's also the factor that we don't have the sources before 1000 AD that tell us about this in the same way. But there's a big spike in the 14th and 15th centuries. It settles down a bit after that. And some work done by colleagues on the Greenland ice cores has shown an interesting correlation whereby wind-blown salt, this is right in the middle of Greenland, so this is powerfully driven salt on North Atlantic storms, seems to perk up quite a lot in the 15th century. And Dawson and Jordan have done some work on sites in the Western Isles using radiocarbon to try and date the period of the greatest sand inundation, and this broadly matches the idea that there was considerable storminess at the beginning of the 15th century, and this has affected sites very widely indeed. And we're only just glimpsing this through these different forms of scientific data. It kind of corroborates the rather more patchy historical record at the time. And of course, famously, what was going on in the beginning of the 15th century over in Greenland was a gradual and then precipitous desertion and collapse of those societies. I use the word collapse advisedly. It's something that Jared Diamond has put forward as a kind of example of the way that humans tend to fail in certain environmental situations. I think we now see this in a bit more of a nuanced way as a result of a lot of more recent research. But this is Valsay on Greenland, where I went in September 2008. That chap in the very colourful jacket is the Bishop of Trondheim, in fact Archbishop, I think, who was there. And the reason for this was that there was a wedding in September 1408 at Valsay Church, which is one of the last things that was recorded in the history of the Greenland settlements. After that, we hear very little. And we went back to commemorate the 600th anniversary of this wedding. I won't go into what happened to the Greenland settlements, but suffice to say, I think there is a lot of divided opinion about this, and it's likely that their final end was a little bit more sort of nuanced than the collapse theory proposed by Diamond. Probably a lot of them just left and went back to Iceland, abandoning their farms. The first part of the Greenland settlement to go was the western settlement and the middle settlement, and eventually the eastern settlement, which is the furthest south of the groups of farms along the fjords. And it's an example of a society which was living very close to the margin of environmental viability. It didn't take very much to push them below that. In Iceland, they had a really bad time in the 15th century as well, but somehow survived. In other parts of the more kind of settled world of Europe, these problems were evident at the time, but we just don't have the dramatic cessation across wide areas. So it's somehow that they seem less serious. But I think there were some really big changes around the coast of Britain at this point. I'm just going to canter through some of my work at Mells on the Wirral, which is an erosion site, but which had been, this is a chart of the Wirral produced in the 18th century. It's right at the tip of the peninsula. You can see a rather hump of land poking out into the Irish Sea at that point. That's now largely gone, and this late 18th century chart shows, this was annotated in the 19th century, the part of the land that disappeared between 1792 and 1848. This was known as Dove Point, and over many years in the 19th century, antiquarians were active collecting material from this eroding landscape. Here they are, notably the Reverend Hume, who's sitting in this portrait on the left. They conflated the medieval archaeology with what is still evident on this coastline, which is a Mesolithic buried forest, which pokes up out of the peat beds from time to time as the sands change. And they thought this was all, from much the same period of time. We now know that there's a much longer kind of chronology to what was going on here, and that the medieval stuff was from sites which were lying above this, and due to erosion the material had kind of sunk down over time into the black peat layers. Splendidly illustrated Victorian antiquarian books give us a good flavour of what was found there. There's stuff from the Iron Age, from the Roman period, from the early Med, and from the High Medieval, but it does seem to come to a bit of a shuddering halt in the 15th century. So then again, I mentioned this particular period of time. There's some good stuff from the very early medieval, from the sub-Roman period, including this pilgrim's flask and Byzantine coins from the Mediterranean, shatters and silver objects from the mid-Saxon to late Saxon periods, and quite a good selection of Viking Age material, which is what initially attracted my attention. But more impressive even than these in terms of quantity are the higher medieval material. And we were immensely fortunate to have our beloved friend and colleague, Jeff Egan, who worked with us on this project between 2003 and 2007 when it was published. And really nobody knew more about medieval material culture than Jeff. And working with Jeff was just an unbelievably enriching experience for me, and to find out about this kind of stuff. And it's all published in a monograph, and such a tragic loss to our subject that he was taken from us. 507 coins, and these help to date the period of prosperity here. We don't really know what the site was. It wasn't a borough, but it seems to have been a kind of beach market with, to some extent, a settlement. We have antiquarian observations of buildings from the 1890s, and we can reconstruct the landscape to some extent, including using map regression, because we have maps from the 1880s, 1890s, when much of this material was being found. It all came to a halt really about 1900, this process of discovery, when the sea walls were built, and then it covered up the areas that the antiquarians had been active in researching, and we were then left with a heritage of a series of museum collections that nobody really understood or had contextualized, and these were the basis of our project. The antiquarians did do some good observations of the sand dunes and the layers below them. This is really quite perceptive for its time in the 1860s. You can see the dune sand above all these darker layers, and this particular chap, Ackroyd Smith, has written into this diagram the dates and also some of the animal bones and environmental evidence that were found there. And we were able to go back and test this with some machine test pitting, and to date some of the layers. And again, we're dating essentially the really big sand build up at this site to around about 1450 onwards, and this is borne out by radiocarbon dates taken on the layers below it. So there's how it seems today, a very changed landscape from the one which the antiquarians came upon nearly 200 years ago, but the lighthouse is still there. That's an 18th century lighthouse, now much closer to the sea than when it was built in the 1770s. Over the other side of Liverpool Bay, there are some townships which are recorded in Domesday Book, these known as argamels, which had disappeared by 1346, Erengameles in the Domesday Book, Ainsdale, which seems to have disappeared in the 14th, 15th centuries, and Raven Mells. Mells is a word taken from Old Norse, and it means it's the plural of sandhills. So where we see the word mells around the coastline, or meols as some people pronounce it, but in the northwest it's very clearly pronounced mells, then this is a signal that there's some kind of interesting sand dune landscape going on here, and that we should be getting our archaeological antennae twitching. So the Mells monograph came out in 2007. It's no longer in print, but it is available via the ADS if you want to download a copy. I don't think I've really got time to talk about my work in Orkney in a comparable level of detail, but I kind of, having looked at a site which had largely eroded and we had a huge collection of material that other people had collected, I decided by moving my interest up to Orkney, where I'd had a long-standing interest in landscape archaeology, that we should use geoprospection techniques to try and find sites which were currently buried in sand dune areas behind some of the big west-facing bays on the mainland of Orkney. And this was connected to Historic Scotland's concerns about coastal erosion, and essentially was trying to produce a form of predictive modelling where, instead of just reacting when the sea had partly destroyed a site and having to have a very last-minute rescue excavation, which is really what had happened until that point, we were trying to use prospection techniques to predict where concentrations of archaeology might exist in the areas that had yet to be eroded, and these could then be understood and managed in a better way going forward into the future. And this monograph came out in 2019 after a 15-year project. There are the areas we worked on the mainland. This is the Bay of Scale Scarabray, you'll be familiar with. It's a Neolithic site, very famous. This was found under sand as well in the 19th century. There are a series of mounds on the north side of the bay in this kind of macha, as it's called in Scotland, the kind of rough, grassy area grazed by cattle, and essentially consisting of large deposits of windblown sand. Snooskar is the only one of the mounds that has a name, but we did a lot of site modelling, geophysics. It's also the location which attracted, our attention in some ways, of a major Viking hoard found in 1858. We weren't trying to find more of the hoard really, but we were trying to understand where that may have been deposited. And this is the bay taken from the west, and these are the mounds that we surveyed and to some extent excavated, modelled using 3D modelling, various survey techniques, and magnetometry. Haven't got time to go into this in detail, but it did show up the concentrations of organic material at the heart of these mounds that indicated to us that they were settlement mounds rather than burial mounds or natural formations. Ground penetrating radar. This is a very interesting use of the technique. It's a few years ago now. This is much more mainstream, but it did show us the buried land surfaces in the mounds, which we later became to understand very clearly through excavation. And here they are in section. You can see the depth of windblown sand, and some of these layers represent attempts by people to stabilize this kind of fast eroding landscape with seaweed and other organic materials, and there would be a period of stability, and then there would be yet more windblown sand coming in, and they would try again. And at some point in the High Middle Ages, the settlement we excavated, which had to be disinterred from a vast amount of windblown sand, was a sort of sand Pompeii, really. This is a Viking longhouse that's nearly 30 meters long. This was abandoned quite quickly as a result of people's kind of despair at being able to carry on in this sandy environment. And the settlements moved only a short distance away, but at the back of the bay, away from the influence of this commodity that was sort of causing so many problems to the local agricultural, and we see a move away from cultivation towards rough grazing at this time.
David, I'm afraid we're nearly running out of time.
Yeah, so I'm going to finish now. So really just a few last slides. This is all in my article, but I was going to talk a bit about the way in which we can use geophysics in sand landscapes to try and predict where sites are, and there's some good examples of this using magnetometry. This is down in Cornwall, less commonly used but also potentially very useful technique: conductivity, electromagnetic conductivity, and finally ground penetrating radar. The issue with that is fixing the plane of measurement from slopes to horizontal, but here's an example in the Middle East. Okay, that's me done. Thank you.